Alright, so last time I covered zombie movies, and today I'm diving into vampire films. Now, the ones I've chosen to focus on aren't your typical bloodsucker movies, and some might be brand new to you. There was a couple that I had watched for the very first time. Now, I'm going to say this up front. The ones on this list, they're not necessarily the greatest vampire stories of all time. Some are excellent, but others, they're just unique, and I wanted to bring attention to them. Now, you may have seen all of them or none of them, but I'd love to know some obscure vampire films that you enjoy, and ones that I should check out, so let me know about those in the comments below. Now, I've put chapter markers in the description so you can jump around if you want, and I'm also going to let you know where I watched them. Now, just about each of these is available in the US on some sort of streaming platform. Now, before I get to the list, I want to give you two that should be on here. Now, I didn't get an opportunity to revisit them, so I just didn't feel comfortable talking about them while they're not fresh in my mind. But if you have never seen the Russian films Night Watch and Day Watch from director Timur Bekmambetov, that's a tough one, Timur Bekmambetov, you really do need to watch them. I mean, Night Watch is from 2004, Day Watch from 2006, and right now, Night Watch is only available on demand, and Day Watch can be seen on Stars. Now, I own both of them, and you might want to get those. All right, so let's get into the list. Number 5 is Vampyr. It's on HBO Max. Now, this is a Criterion one, and this is only on the list because it is extremely old and it should be experienced, much like watching Nosferatu. Now, Vampyr was produced in German, French, and English. It's from 1932, but then some of it was destroyed or damaged, including the audio and the music. Now, luckily, this has now been restored, so we can enjoy this look back on some of the early days of filmmaking. Now, the story follows a character named Alan Gray, who's obsessed with supernatural lore. And he comes to stay at this inn, and he encounters a woman who is slowly turning into a vampire. I love the production values within this. There's a lot of creativity employed at creating the atmosphere and the tone for the story. Now, I love the use of shadows that showcase action on our walls. So we'll see actions playing out solely with the shadows, helping to create movement as well as progressing our story. And there are also times when the camera does a great job of panning on something to draw our attention to just a creepy element in a location, but then it turns back to watch Alan Gray walking away in the other direction. And I mean, it's almost surprised that the character wasn't examining the things that we were being shown. Now, at points, it makes the camera almost a living character within the film, or it puts us in the story through these camera movements. Now, this is a slower and quieter presentation with minimal dialogue in the first half. Now, it's relying on the music to inform a lot of the atmosphere when it's combined with the actors' movements and their expressions. And the scenes are drawn out at times. I mean, sometimes creating an unsettling effect, and other times just making the actions drag. I mean, the camera lingers on a subject for an uncomfortable amount of time. I mean, in some of these, I just really couldn't figure out what the reasoning was for. Now, I was really enjoying the isolated location. It created loneliness and sadness. Plus, there's this very creepy old doctor who comes into the story, and he's very crotchety and mysterious, and he just adds to that whole loneliness also. Now, the story leans more heavily on the spiritual or the religious aspect of vampirism and the connotations of really giving oneself to the devil rather than telling this as a just standalone or a straightforward monster story. Now, the thing that absolutely blew me away through this was the cinematography and the effects. Now, in a scene in the latter part of the film, there's a character who is ghost-like and wandering around, as semi-transparent. So we could see through him as he moved about the set. Now, today, that's not impressive. For 1932, that's kind of cool. There's also a great scene towards the end of the movie that features the camera looking up through a window in a coffin. Now, it provides a very unique perspective that's also haunting. And as the coffin is then being transported, we get to see from the body's viewpoint. We see trees moving overhead, and it's just really an eerie way to experience this part of the story. Now, I know this isn't going to be everybody's cup of tea, but it is worth checking out just to be impressed by what was created almost a century ago. Coming in at number 4, it's Cronos, which is on HBO Max. Now, Guillermo del Toro is extremely creative, and in 1993, he directed the vampire story called Cronos. Well, again, this is a different look at vampirism. Now, the premise is that there is this device called the Cronos device that was designed by an alchemist hundreds of years ago, and it prolonged the guy's life who wanted it created. And it was hidden, and now some other ailing wealthy guy is looking for it. And then in the story, we meet another older guy, Jesus, and he owns an antique shop. Now, he discovers the device in a statue, and he accidentally activates it. And then, later, he activates it again on purpose, and it begins to have a healing effect on his body. Wounds heal quickly, and he begins to feel younger. Now, I love the idea of the lore within this, where a device can affect a person and cause them to live much longer than is natural. Now, I also love the side effects of using the device. As with so many cautionary tales, the thing that looks like a dream come true typically has a high price attached to it. And in this case, the user of the device has to consume blood in order to maintain the effects. Ron Perlman stars in this as a henchman to the wealthy old guy who's looking for that device. Now, Perlman is very quirky, and he rides that edge between serious and silliness with his character. And there are times when he's menacing, but at the same time, I almost had a hard time taking him seriously because of some of his goofy mannerisms. Now, he does become scary at one point, but most of the time, I wasn't sure if I should laugh or wince. Now, something I love about this, and what also helps to set this apart from other vampire-ish movies, is that Jesus doesn't fall into that self-centered mindset that is typically shown with immortality. There's this cockiness that usually comes with being impervious to death, but Jesus doesn't approach it this way. I mean, yeah, he enjoys the effects of feeling younger, but he doesn't like the cost, and he's not sure it's worth the price. Now, there are some practical effects that are used in this, and they're very impressive, and then disgusting. I mean, they help to reinforce the price of using this Cronos device, showing us how it may not be all that it's cracked up to be. Something that I appreciated is that in this, it's meant to knock our senses off kilter. And Jesus has a granddaughter who shadows him pretty much throughout the movie. Now, we see her innocence and how Jesus works to protect her. But there's a moment that is made to be shocking by using that innocence in an extreme situation. Now, the act isn't lingered on, and okay, nothing happens to the kid. I mean, I don't want your mind to just go off and wander there. But the whole scene, it really helps to solidify Jesus in his trajectory. Now, this is one that's good for a one-time watch. I don't think I'm going to revisit it, though. I mean, it's quieter in its presentation, and while it feels a little slower than only 93 minutes, it does move efficiently. And I think some of that slow feel just comes from extended portions without dialogue, which isn't a bad thing. Number 3 is Only Lovers Left Alive on HBO Max, and it stars Tilda Swinton, Tom Hiddleston, Anton Yelchin, and Mia Wasikowska. Now, it's directed by Jim Jarmusch, and it's a very slow burn of a movie. Hiddleston and Swinton are Adam and Eve, respectively, and when we meet them, they're living in separate areas of the world, but they're also sharing a very similarly lonely and quiet existence. Adam's a musician who's in a depressive state of mind. And he's reclusive, he barely ever leaves the house, and he absolutely loves his anonymity. Eve is in Tangier, and she looks to be less depressed, but still a bit lonely. And they're both cryptic in their interactions, but we learn very quickly that they require blood to be sustained. There's a lot of self-indulgence with the filmmaking here. There are so many long and drawn-out sequences that are allowed to play out so that a song or maybe the musical score can fill the air. I mean, it's not all necessary, but this does create a mood for the presentation, too. Now, the movie's just over 2 hours, and I felt the time a ton. I mean, I still liked the movie overall, especially with the quiet sadness that permeates the story. We're just really watching these people who have lived on Earth and together for a really long time, and they're somewhat bored or maybe even ambivalent to humanity. I mean, Adam refers to humans as zombies. I love that. I mean, yet, though, he still interacts with a select few. And he has dealings with Anton Yelchin. And oh, it's so great to see him on screen again. But his character is inquisitive, very chill, and he's gotten enough info at some point to just go along with whatever Adam asks, no matter how weird it might be. And then there's Jeffrey Wright. Now, he's a doctor that Adam sees to get blood. And their interactions are strained and then very funny. But then this super subtle way that only Wright can deliver. Now, for me, the dynamic between Adam and Eve is what makes this worth watching. They have such a long shared history together that their relationship arc is filled with knowing and understanding, but also no nonsense. I mean, that allows them then to function together flawlessly. And there's a certain romanticism to their shared arc, which leans heavily into the idealistic portion of immortality. There's not a ton of gore or even violence in this one, but we do witness a lot of blood drinking, and it's typically, though, from a glass. So if you're looking for fangs, you are going to have to be very patient for that payoff. And for me, this was great for a one-time watch too, but it's not something that I'm going to revisit. The performances are quiet, they're patient, and that drew me in and kept me engaged. But the slowness of the execution and then just the lingering of the scenes, it doesn't make me excited to rewatch it. Number 2 is Thirst from 2009. I saw it on Peacock. And it's a South Korean take on vampires. But just like some of the others in this list, it's not a traditional approach. So a priest takes part in a medical experiment that leaves him with an insatiable thirst for blood. This tackles the themes of desire and duty. And the film is directed by Park Chan-wook, who also did the original Oldboy. And it stars Song Kang-ho, who I think he's just spectacular. I mean, he's the priest, and he turns in such a great performance. He's conflicted by his vows of the priesthood and his growing desires thanks to the effects of the experiment. Now, I love the way this shows desire. The priest just wants to help others and serve them. And he spends time caring for his comatose friend, and then he often visits with a family that he's close to. And he has to try and balance the divide between accessing blood for survival and not harming others. But the changes in him aren't just with his appetite, and that's what creates this massive internal struggle for him. Now, with the family he spends a lot of time with, there is a woman she's slightly off. Now, her husband is even more off, but in a completely different way. But the young woman, she doesn't really fight her desires, and this then creates a huge amount of the story conflict. And what makes this unique is that the priest doesn't have fangs. I mean, he can walk around in the daylight, but he does have heightened senses and increased strength. And there are some really great and gross practical effects, especially where blood is concerned. Now, some of the gnarliest times are seen when the priest is starving and needs to feed. And what happens to him, it's pretty visual and nasty. Now, cinematography is also great at capturing the characters in ways that keep us at bay from them, like the camera's trying to protect us or show us how much a particular character is a stranger. But then there are other times where the camera pushes in uncomfortably close, where we're probably a little bit more intimate than we want. But both are really effective in capturing the right tone for a scene. And this also doesn't shy away from the violence. There are a couple of times where there are brutal and close-quarter sequences that are tense and they're even slightly emotional. Now, because this is dealing with desires and we have at least one character that's losing all inhibitions, there are some sex scenes in this that you probably wouldn't want to watch with your parents or your kids. Could be a bit uncomfortable. Sprinkled throughout is a bit of subtle comedy also. And this isn't a laugh out loud stuff. I mean, it's just things that are humorous due to actions, behaviors, or the reactions of some of the characters within their situations. Now, when we reach the finale, it feels earned, and it's very fitting for the character journey that we've been witnessing. There's not a lot of happiness to be found here, but it is a good conclusion. Okay, I want to hit up an honorable mention, and that is The Hunger from 1983. It is available on HBO Max. This is a very 80s movie in the look, feel, and the execution. It stars Catherine Deneuve, David Bowie, and Susan Sarandon, and it's directed by Tony Scott. There is a lot of loud synth music offset by jarring transitions to then silence, and then the whole production has this cold tone to it, with lots of blues and grays that just filter the light in about every way. Now, we've also got the characters that wear sunglasses in the dark, and just about everybody has their hair slicked back and up so that they look like they would fit in with the greasers and the outsiders. I mean, this is another movie that's a very different look at vampires. The eternal life thing is present, as is drinking blood, but we never see sharp fangs or even super speed. And to tie in with the title, when a person is turned, they begin to have an overwhelming desire to feed, and it overpowers their senses and it controls their desires. They hunger for blood. As with a lot of 80s films, there's a stylized sensuality that the story tries to establish. But I don't think there's enough development on the characters to really create a good tie to any of them, which would make any emotional connection or even any sexiness bubble up to the surface. The editing is abrupt, even distracting and off-putting at times, because the scenes will flash back and forth between several actions or even locations, but only staying on one of them for like a second or less. I mean, when this happens, the sound also changes, which is aggravating to the ears. It doesn't really create a pleasing experience when these are happening. Luckily, they're not all the time. Now, the idea of desire, longing, and eternal life, I think it works well for the central narrative, but there are ways that this could have been so much more effectively written to then make a story that had more meat to it. Susan Sarandon's a doctor performing research on aging, and it's intriguing. I mean, and even some of the imagery that we see is visceral and it's kind of creative, but it feels like a half thought within her story. I mean, her research is what drives her curiosity, which then leads her to encounter Catherine Deneuve. But Sarandon's whole storyline leading up to that point then gets forgotten. I mean, it's making those sequences become pretty inconsequential. And the film's only 96 minutes, so it really could have used another 20-ish to round out the story. But even with that shortcoming, I mean, this is quintessential 80s glam. There is a haunting element to the loud music, the sparse marble interiors, I mean, even the dark shadows. And even though David Bowie is billed in the top 3 for this, I mean, he has a relatively small part in the story. Now, I like him in that part, but it just doesn't call for a large amount of screen time for him. This is definitely another example of a different vampire film, which is, of course, why it made the list. And there's not much that's creepy in it. Instead, the movie goes for the sultry and the sensual vibe, romanticizing eternal life and then glamorizing the carefree lifestyle, at least for a little bit. The ending is strange, but I think also somewhat fitting. It retains some of that 80s rich optimism of success and longevity. All right, so number one, Let the Right One In. It's available on Amazon. Now, this is one of my favorites on the list. It's from 2008. Now, there is an English language remake that I didn't like nearly as much as this one. And then Showtime is just releasing a series about this film with the exact same title starring Damien Bashir. I don't really understand the need for a series, but I'm also not here to talk about it. So I just want to focus on the Swedish movie, which is the original and the best. The story follows a boy and a girl, Oscar and Ellie. Now, Oscar's a loner, he's bullied at school, and he spends most of his time alone while his mom works to support them. And Ellie is new to the apartments where Oscar lives, and she appears to be about the same age as Oscar, but she's certainly different. And despite the weather being winter and snowy, Ellie will walk around outside without a jacket and sometimes even in bare feet. We learned very early on that the adult man living with Ellie is collecting blood for her to drink. So now we've got a young-looking vampire, which is pretty unsettling. But what makes this is the quiet storytelling that works to build a friendship and then love between Oscar and Ellie. I mean, the friendship is awkward, just like one would be between a boy and a girl. They're matter-of-fact, but also shy. But I really love the openness that Oscar has. It convincingly showcases how alone he is, but how earnest of a friend he can be. Now, he's got a great heart, and we see that through small actions, like he loans Ellie his Rubik's Cube because she's never even seen one before. And then he learns Morse code and teaches Ellie so that they can communicate through their shared wall of their apartment, just to keep them connected even when they're separated and alone. But for as sweet as a lot of this is, there's also a wickedly violent arc to the story. From Ellie's father figure trying to gather blood for her to the way we watch Ellie just go ham on people when she becomes desperate to eat. And while not all of the violence is shown in up-close detail, I mean, there's enough blood spurting to really satisfy. Now, I don't think this is ever really creepy or even scary. It's a relationship story at the heart, just one that happens to feature a kid who feeds on people. Now, one of the greatest scenes of violence comes at the end of the movie, and despite us not being shown much of the actions, we see the ramifications. And they're visceral, and then they're also slightly funny. I mean, the outcome is very fitting, and a resolution I think most are going to root for, even though it's a very disturbing premise. It is just under 2 hours long, and honestly, the time goes by really efficiently. The story is enveloping, and it's very touching when you look at it from the perspective of friendship and love. If you've never seen this, or maybe you've only ever seen the American remake called Let Me In, or maybe it's just been a while since you've watched this, give it a go. I mean, it is well worth the time, and the story still holds up, making for a touchingly violent story. All right, so that's it for the list. I hope there was at least one on here that piqued your interest to either check out or revisit. Let me know some of your suggestions, though, for lesser-known vampire movies, or just even vampire movies that you really enjoy. Tell me in the comments. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.